When S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 came out back in November 2024, the reception was complicated. The game possessed an absurdly ambitious vision, a living, unpredictable zone filled with genuine, emergent gameplay. But what arrived on our PCs was a quagmire of bugs, broken AI, and an A-life system that barely functioned. The potential was there, the execution, not so much. And now, with the new 2026 updates, bringing major upgrades to Unreal Engine 5.5, new missions, new combat systems, mutants that actually react, and even NPCs that loot the enemies you drop. The burning question is, has the time come? Did S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 finally become the game it was meant to be, or are we still waiting? Stay with me until the end of the video, and let's find out. From the beginning, when S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 arrived in that chaotic state full of bugs and performance issues, most people who played it didn't leave saying, this game has a bad idea. What cropped up in conversations, forums, and comments was something different. It was that frustrating feeling of seeing something with enormous potential being delivered prematurely. And that makes all the difference. There are games you play where you realize the concept itself doesn't work, the core design is flawed, and it won't go anywhere no matter how much they try to fix it. S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 was never that case. The Chernobyl zone had atmosphere, the survival and exploration loop had personality, and the progression sucked you into that world even when everything around it was breaking. The fundamentals were there, buried under a thick layer of technical issues. And that is exactly what made the initial experience so painful to watch. When a game is bad at its core, you just discard it and move on. But when you can clearly see what the game wants to be, when you feel those moments where everything clicks and the game embraces you the right way, then the disappointment goes much deeper. You weren't rejecting the game, you were mourning a version of it that didn't exist yet. This distinction matters a lot to understand what happened later with the game. GSC Game World didn't need to reinvent the wheel. They needed to honor what was already there. And when the conversation around a game revolves around this needs to be fixed instead of this needs to be reimagined, the chances of a real recovery increase considerably. The idea was never the problem. Never. There is a very fine line between a bad game and an unfinished game, and many people confuse the two all the time. When S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 arrived, this confusion was immediate. One part of the community declared, bad game, not worth the price, avoid it. Another part defended every aspect tooth and nail. And you know what's interesting? Both sides were looking at the same game and seeing completely different things, because deep down they were answering different questions. Those who saw a bad game were answering the question, what do I have in my hands today? And the honest answer was hard to swallow, crashes, unstable performance, bugs that broke entire quests, and systems that didn't seem to communicate with each other. By that metric, the criticism made sense. But those who defended the game were answering a different question. What is this game trying to be? And there, the answer changed completely, because the ambition was written in every corner of the zone. So the real question remains, did S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 fail, or did it arrive too early? And I think the honest answer is that both things can be true at the same time. A launch in an unfinished state is a genuine failure. No one needs to downplay that. But an unfinished game is not the same thing as a game without value, direction, or purpose. They are different categories, and mixing the two causes us to lose the ability to evaluate what really matters. Because in the end, a game's story doesn't end on launch day. And S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 is perhaps one of the clearest examples in recent years that judging a game solely by its day, one snapshot can make you miss something that over time becomes much bigger than any launch review managed to capture. Even when S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 was stumbling badly in technical aspects, there was one thing that never let the game fall entirely: the atmosphere. It was what kept you there even after a bug, a performance drop, or a broken moment. Because the zone worked. And it worked in a way that few games can replicate. There is a constant sense of unease in S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 that doesn't depend on jump scares, nor does it rely on loud music telling you when to feel afraid. It is that heavy silence, that walk where nothing happens for too long until you start imagining that something should be happening. And then comes the tension, not explicit, but almost psychological, as if the game were watching you the entire time. The loneliness also carries a lot of weight. You don't feel like a hero, nor someone special in there. You are just another person trying to survive in a place that clearly doesn't want you around. And this creates a feeling of constant vulnerability, as if any wrong step could put you in a dead end. And often, you don't even need a visible enemy for that. Perhaps the strongest element of all is this concept of invisible danger. You don't always know where the threat is coming from or if it even exists at that moment, but the game makes you feel like you are always one step away from something going horribly wrong. And that is what kept many people playing even when everything else failed, because when the atmosphere hits the mark like that, it carries the game on its back without asking for permission. As time passed, it seems S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 began to breathe a bit easier. And it is not just because of patches or technical improvements, but also because the way people view the game has shifted. At launch, the weight of the hype was absurd. It was the kind of expectation that transforms any flaw into a massive disappointment, because many people were already expecting a practically perfect game. And along with that hype came the comparisons. Comparisons to the old games in the franchise, to other survival shooters, to anything that had a more polished technical standard. Except that created an almost impossible scenario for the game to win. Because instead of being analyzed for what it was, S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 was constantly being measured against what people wanted it to be. There was also this expectation of technical perfection that simply did not align with the game's ambitious premise. A dense, systemic world full of variables that rarely arrives flawless on day one. And when it didn't, the backlash was immediate. However, now, with time, those demands have eased a bit, and that opens up space for a more honest reading of the experience. Today, it feels like you can view S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 with less noise. Without the exaggerated weight of the hype, without the need to compare every detail, and without that demand for absolute perfection. And it is in this environment that the game begins to better display what it truly is. Not what was envisioned, not what was imagined, but what it actually manages to deliver. One thing that needs to be clear about S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 is that it never tried to be a game for everyone. And perhaps part of the frustration at launch comes precisely from that. Many people went in expecting a more straightforward, faster FPS full of constant action, and ran straight into something much slower, denser, and at various moments, even uncomfortable to play, because S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 demands patience. It is in no hurry to impress you. It doesn't throw things in your face every 5 minutes. A large part of the experience lies in walking, observing, listening to the environment, and interpreting subtle signs. It is a type of game that rewards those who slow down, but it can alienate anyone looking for constant stimulation. Exploration follows this exact same logic. It isn't about running around marking objectives on the map. It's about getting lost, hesitating, and turning back when something feels wrong. And this is accompanied by a constant sense of unease. It isn't that fun, fleeting discomfort. It is something heavier, quieter, that accumulates as you play. Ultimately, this explains why the experience is so divisive. Those who enter expecting uninterrupted action will probably end up frustrated, but those who accept the game's pacing, who understand that it aims to be more contemplative than explosive, find something quite different there. It is not about pleasing everyone. It is about knowing exactly what you want to be, even if it costs you part of the audience along the way. One of the most interesting things is how the zone works best precisely when it appears completely indifferent to your presence. It isn't the kind of world that revolves around the player, placing you at the center of everything. On the contrary, many times you feel like you're just passing through, as if that place already existed long before you arrived and will continue to exist after you leave. This shows up a lot in unexpected encounters. You are walking with no clear objective, and suddenly you hear gunshots in the distance, find a group in conflict, or see a situation that clearly wasn't set up for you. These are moments that feel natural, almost accidental, and that is exactly what gives weight to the experience. It isn't a scripted event trying to impress you, it is the world simply happening. And along with that comes a constant sense of lack of control. You don't always decide when a situation begins, and often you don't decide how it ends either. You can get mixed up in something larger than you expected, or end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this shatters that common expectation that the player is always in absolute command of the experience. It is this feeling that the world does not revolve around you that makes Stalker 2 so different. The zone isn't there to serve you. It doesn't adapt to you. You are the one who needs to adapt to it. And when the game gets this right, it creates a much rawer immersion, almost uncomfortable, but also far more authentic than most games in the genre manage to deliver. There is a curious sensation when you return to Stalker 2 today. The game feels better, but not necessarily because it turned into something else. It feels better because now it can breathe. Before, it was as if every moment of immersion was being interrupted by technical issues, stutters, bugs, or performance drops that completely broke the mood. And that carries much more weight than it seems. Because Stalker 2 depends on pacing. It depends on that prolonged silence, the unhurried walk, the tension that builds up gradually. When the game doesn't run well, this pacing is lost. Fear turns into frustration, exploration turns into a nuisance, and the atmosphere simply cannot sustain itself. Now, with a more stable experience, these elements finally have room to exist the right way. Silence becomes uncomfortable again, rather than empty. Exploration becomes curiosity again, rather than an obligation. Environmental tension begins to work because it isn't being interrupted at every turn. And this completely changes how you experience the game. The most interesting part is that this doesn't stem from a complete transformation. Stalker 2 didn't need to reinvent itself. It just needed to function better to display what was already there from the start. And when that happens, you realize that the core of the game was never the problem. It was just being suffocated. Stalker 2 is not a game that sustains itself solely on traditional progress, constant rewards, or that checklist complete feeling. It operates much more on the basis of feeling. It is the kind of experience where often what you take away isn't a rare item or a completed mission, it's what you felt while you were inside. Because the most memorable moments are almost never the most important ones on paper. It's walking alone through the zone without knowing exactly what you will encounter. It's hearing gunshots in the distance and wondering whether to approach or change direction. It's entering an abandoned building with that constant fear of not being alone, even when nothing is visible there. And then there is the kind of situation where you simply survive by a hair, an encounter that went wrong, a resource that ran out at the worst time, a desperate escape that, in the end, leaves you with the feeling of, I shouldn't have made it out of there alive. These moments stick in the memory much longer than any objective marked on the map. In the end, Stalker 2 creates stories that are yours. They aren't just the missions written by the developers, but the small narratives that emerge naturally while you play. And perhaps that is why it works so well for those who approach it with the right mindset, because the game isn't just giving you content, it's giving you experiences that you build yourself. There is something in Stalker 2 that many people find strange right off the bat. It doesn't want to make you comfortable. And this goes against practically everything modern games have been doing for years. Today, most games try to keep you constantly rewarded, always moving forward, always feeling in control. Not here. Here, the game makes a point of reminding you that you are not safe. And this appears in the little things. Inventory never feels like enough. Every decision to carry an item carries real weight. Journeys are long, sometimes too quiet, and you begin to question if it's really worth moving forward. There isn't that constant flow of rewards pushing you to continue. Progress is slow, almost uncomfortable. Yet, along with that comes a tension that never lets go. It isn't just difficulty, it's vulnerability. You never feel fully prepared, never feel like you dominate the situation. There is always that real risk, that feeling that any mistake could cost you dearly. And this completely changes how you play. You think more, hesitate more, and respect the world more. And perhaps that is precisely where the game's strength lies. Because instead of trying to please you all the time, it challenges you to adapt. And when you accept this pacing, when you enter this rawer and less comfortable logic, the experience begins to make a lot more sense. It isn't an easy game to like, but when it clicks, it becomes hard to forget. So the question remains in the air. Did Stalker 2 finally become the game it was meant to be? And the more I think about it, the harder it gets to give a simple answer. Because it's not as if all the problems have vanished and you can't pretend the launch didn't leave clear marks on the experience. But at the same time, playing today there is greater clarity in what the game wants to be. Things that previously seemed confusing or poorly executed now begin to make more sense within the premise. Not because everything was fixed perfectly, but because the vision behind the game is more visible. And perhaps that is the most important point. Understanding the intention completely changes how you view the experience. When you stop expecting the game to be something else and begin to accept the pacing, the choices, and even the discomforts it proposes, everything starts to fit together in a different way. In the end, maybe the answer isn't about whether or not it became the envisioned game. Perhaps it's about finally being able to see the game for what it always wanted to be. Because maybe Stalker 2 was never made to impress immediately, maybe it was always meant to be felt gradually.